The Letter, the Witch, and the Ring by John Bellairs, Chapter 3. Mrs. Zimmerman knelt there on the littered floor, staring at the empty ring box. Suddenly she laughed. "Ha! That's a good joke on whoever our burglar was." Rosita was dumbfounded. "I don't get what you mean, Mrs. Zimmerman." Mrs. Zimmerman got up and brushed dust off her dress. She pitched the ring box contemptuously into the empty drawer. "It's very simple, my dear, don't you see? Ole must have blabbed around that mysterious story about a magic ring. Someone must have believed him and figured there was something valuable hidden here in the house. After all, you wouldn't have to think a ring was magic to want to steal it. Rings are usually made of precious metals like gold and silver, and some of them are set with diamonds and rubies and such like. After Ole died, somebody must have broken in. I can imagine what he found. Probably an old faucet washer. Well, it could be worse. They might have set fire to the place. The house is a mess, though, and you and I will have to do some tidying up. Now then," Mrs. Zimmerman went on chattering as she straightened up Ole's desk, putting the pencils in the pencil jar and erasers into cubby holes. Who the heck does she think she's fooling? Rosita thought. She could tell from the way Mrs. Zimmerman was acting that this was all just a cover-up. She had seen Mrs. Zimmerman's hand tremble as she opened the little box. She had seen how pale she looked. So there really is a magic ring, Rosita thought to herself. I wonder what it looks like. She also wondered who had taken it and what they were going to do with it. She had walked into a real-life mystery, and she was so excited about the whole business that she really wasn't scared at all. It was nearly midnight when Rosita and Mrs. Zimmerman finally sat down to have their picnic supper. They laid out their meal on the kitchen table and fetched some dusty plates and tarnished silverware from the cupboard over the sink. After that, it was time to turn in. There were 2 adjoining bedrooms at the top of the stairs, each with its own small dark oak bedstead. Rosita and Mrs. Zimmerman rummaged in a linen closet at the end of the hall, and they found some sheets. The sheets smelled musty, but they were clean. They made up their beds and said goodnight to each other. Rosita had trouble getting to sleep. It was a hot, still night, and not a breath of air was stirring. The curtains on the open windows hung still. She tossed and turned, but it was no use. Finally, Rosita sat up and turned on the lamp on the bedside table. She dug into her valise for the copy of Treasure Island that she brought along to read, and she propped her pillow up against the head of the bed. Now then, where had she left off? Oh, sure, here it was. Long John Silver had captured Jim, and the pirates were searching for Captain Flint's treasure. It was an exciting part of the book. Jim had a rope around his middle and was being dragged along over the sand by Silver, who swung along jauntily on his crutch. Tap, tap, tap. As she read, Rosita began to be aware of a sound. At first she thought it was in her head. She often imagined sights and sounds and smells when she was reading, and now maybe she was imagining the sound of Long John Silver's crutch. Tap, tap, tap. It didn't sound like that, though. More like a coin being wrapped on a desktop. And anyway, a crutch wouldn't make any noise on the sand. It would just... Rosita's head drooped forward. The book fell from her hand, and she realized what was happening. She shook herself violently. What a dope I am for falling asleep, she thought. But then she remembered that she was trying to read herself to sleep. I guess it worked, Rosita thought with a grin. Tap, tap, tap. There was the sound again. Where was it coming from? It certainly wasn't in her head. It was coming from Mrs. Zimmerman's room. And then Rosita knew what the sound was. It was Mrs. Zimmerman rapping her ring on something. Mrs. Zimmerman had a ring with a large stone set in it. The stone was purple because Mrs. Zimmerman loved purple things. It wasn't a magic ring. It was just a trinket that Mrs. Zimmerman liked. She had gotten it at Coney Island. She wore it all the time, and whenever she was thinking about something, thinking really hard, she wrapped the ring on whatever happened to be around. Chairs or tabletops or bookshelves. The door was closed between the 2 rooms, but Rosita could see, in her mind's eye, a clear picture of Mrs. Zimmerman lying awake, staring at the ceiling and rapping her ring against the sideboard of the bed. What was she thinking about? The ring, probably the other ring, the stolen one. Rosita really wanted to go in and talk the whole matter over with Mrs. Zimmerman, but she knew that was not the thing to do. Mrs. Zimmerman would shut up like a clam if Rosita tried to talk to her about Ole Gunderson's magic ring. Rosita shrugged her shoulders and sighed. There was nothing she could do, and anyway, she was nearly asleep. She fluffed her pillow up, turned out the light, and stretched out. In no time at all, she was snoring peacefully. The next morning, bright and early, Rosita and Mrs. Zimmerman got their things together, locked up the house, and drove off toward Petoskey. They had breakfast in a cafe there and went to see Ole's lawyer. Then they drove on toward the Straits. That afternoon they crossed the Straits of Mackinac in a car ferry called the City of Escanaba. The sky was gray and it was raining. The ferry boat heaved ponderously in the choppy waters of the Straits. On their right, Mrs. Zimmerman and Roswitha could just barely see Mackinac Island, a gray, blurry smudge. The sun was coming out when the city of Escanaba reached St. Ignace. They were in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan now, and they were going to have 2 whole weeks to explore it. The trip started off well. They saw Taquanaman Falls and drove along the shore of Lake Superior. They saw the pictured rocks and snapped photos of each other. They drove through rolling oceans of pine trees and stopped to look at the streams that ran red because there was so much iron in the water. They visited towns with strange names like Ishpeming and Germfast and Ontonagon. And they stayed in tourist homes. Mrs. Zimmerman hated the new motels that were springing up all over the place, but she loved tourist homes, old white houses on shady back streets, houses with screened porches and green shutters and sagging trellises with morning glories or hollyhocks in them. Mrs. Zimmerman and Roswitha would settle down for the night in a tourist home and sit on the porch playing chess or cards or drinking iced tea while the crickets chirped outside. Sometimes there was a radio in Roswitha's room. If there was, she would listen to the Detroit Tigers night games until she got sleepy. And then in the morning, breakfast in a diner or cafe, and then back on the road again. On the 4th day of their trip, something odd happened. It was evening. Roswitha and Mrs. Zimmerman were walking down the main street of a little town. The sun was setting at the end of the street, and a hot orange light lay on everything. They had had their dinner, and were just stretching their legs after a long day of driving. Roswitha was ready to go back to the tourist home, but Mrs. Zimmerman had stopped to look in the window of a junk shop. She loved to browse in junk shops. She could spend hours sifting through all sorts of trash, and sometimes she had to be dragged away by force. As she stood by the window, Mrs. Zimmerman noticed the store was open. It was 9 o'clock at night, but the owners of junk shops often keep odd hours. She went in, and Roswitha followed her. There were old chairs with ratty velvet upholstery, and bookcases with a few books in them, and old dining room tables with an incredible assortment of junk laid out on them. Mrs. Zimmerman stopped in front of one of these tables. She picked up a salt and pepper set shaped like a fielder's mitten ball. The ball was the salt. "How'd you like this for your room, Roswitha?" she said, chuckling. Roswitha said she would love it. She liked anything that had to do with baseball. "Gee, could I have it for my desk, Mrs. Zimmerman? I think it's kind of cute." "Okay," said Mrs. Zimmerman, still laughing. She paid the owner 25 cents for the set and went on browsing. Next to a dusty bowl full of mother-of-pearl buttons was a stack of old photographs. They were all printed on heavy cardboard, and from the clothes that people in the pictures were wearing, they must have been pretty old. Humming, Mrs. Zimmerman shifted through the stack. Suddenly, she gasped. Roswitha, who had been standing nearby, turned and looked at Mrs. Zimmerman. Her face was pale, and the hand that held the photograph was trembling. "What's wrong, Mrs. Zimmerman?" Come over here, Roswitha, and look at this." Roswitha went to Mrs. Zimmerman's side and looked at the picture she was holding. It showed a woman in an old-fashioned floor-length dress. She was standing by the bank of a river, and she had a canoe paddle in her hand. Beside her, a canoe was pulled up on the bank. A man in a striped jacket was sitting cross-legged next to the canoe. He had a handlebar mustache and was playing a banjo. The man looked handsome, but it was impossible to tell what the lady looked like. Someone had scraped the face of the lady away with a knife or a razor blade. Roswitha still didn't see what was bothering Mrs. Zimmerman, but as she stood there wondering, Mrs. Zimmerman turned the picture over. On the back, these words were written: "Florence and Mordecai, summer 1905. "My gosh!" exclaimed Roswitha. "Is that a picture of you?" Mrs. Zimmerman nodded. "It is, or rather it was, until someone did that to it." She swallowed hard. How the heck did a picture of you get way up here, Mrs. Zimmerman? Did you used to live up here? No, I did not. I've never seen this town in my life before. It's all... Well, it's very strange. Mrs. Zimmerman's voice shook as she spoke. Roswitha could see very clearly that she was upset. Mrs. Zimmerman was the sort of person who usually gave you the feeling that she had everything under control. She was a calm, sensible sort, so when she got upset, you knew there was a reason. Mrs. Zimmerman bought the photograph from the old man in the shop and took it back to the tourist home with her. On the way, she explained to Roswitha that witches and warlocks hacked up pictures that way when they wanted to get rid of somebody. Sometimes they let water drip on the photo until a face was worn away, or they might scrape the face off with a knife. Either way, it was like making a wax doll of somebody and sticking pins in it. It was a way of murdering somebody by magic. Roswitha's eyes opened wide. You mean somebody's trying to do something to you? Mrs. Zimmerman laughed nervously. No, I don't mean that at all. The whole thing, finding the picture of myself up here and finding it damaged, well, it's just a funny coincidence. But when you fool around with magic the way I do, well, you get some strange ideas into your head. I mean, sometimes you have to be careful. Roswitha blinked. I don't get what you mean. I mean, I'm going to burn this picture, Mrs. Zimmerman said. I'm going to burn the picture, Mrs. Zimmerman snapped. Now, I'd rather not talk about it anymore, if you don't mind. Later that night, Roswitha lay in bed trying to sleep. Mrs. Zimmerman, was downstairs in the guest parlor reading, or at least that's what she was supposed to be doing. On a hunch, Roswitha got up and went to the window. She remembered that she had seen an incinerator in the backyard. Sure enough, there was Mrs. Zimmerman standing over the wire incinerator. Something was burning with a soft red glow at the bottom of the cage. Mrs. Zimmerman stood hunched over, watching it. The reddish light flickered over her face. Roswitha felt afraid. She went back to bed and tried to sleep. But the picture of Mrs. Zimmerman standing there over her fire, like a witch in an old story, kept coming back to her. What was going on? And that's the end of chapter 3.